All right, thank you very much. Perfect. I hope you can all see that, and I hope it will move once I click on here. All right. Otherwise, please just interrupt me and tell me, but things should actually work out just fine. Okay, so thank you very much again. In this talk, I would like to discuss the diachrony of verbal paraphrases denoting perfect and passive sense, with a special emphasis on whether these cross-linguistically follow similar paths and whether they converge in the same participial forms, basically. So in terms of setting the stage, what we can see in Germanic and Romance languages is that the verbal paraphrases denoting the passive and the perfect, like the ones in 1 and 2 here, taken from German and English, these actually exhibit stative counterparts like those in 3 and 4. So here we have so-called resultative constructions or stative constructions, basically semi-copular and copular configurations that I will simply refer to as stative perfect and stative passive for this talk. What's interesting about these is that they apparently predate their eventive counterparts and seem to serve as the source of their reanalysis. So as the source of the reanalysis of these eventive counterparts, that is. Now, such stative configurations, as we can see here in 5 and 6 again, are typically based on resultative adjectival participles occurring in co-predicative and predicative contexts. Hence, in the examples in 5 and 6, actually what we get is the resultative state of the participial event that is being folded or being packed, which is attributed to the DP in question, so to arms and bags, basically. Now, these participial elements are typically taken to be decausative, so the external argument is typically taken to be absent altogether, as well as resultative. So typically a resultative state is taken to be attributed to the DP in question. All right. Now, what's interesting about this is that we basically find these stative configurations in all languages, grammaticalizing passive and perfect paraphrases, from the very beginning, so to speak. So here we have some examples from Old High German, Old English, and Latin for the ancestor of the perfect construction, the stative perfect in 7, 8, and 9. Where we have a combination of have, basically a semi-copular element, with this resultative adjective, so to speak. And in 10 and 11, we can see some stative passives from Old High German and Old English, which are combinations of be with this resultative element, basically. Okay. Now, if we assume that there is a diachronic relation between these co-predicative and predicative configurations, which could roughly be analyzed like this, and their eventive counterparts, which should rather be analyzed as proper combinations of auxiliaries and verbal participial elements, if we assume that there is such a diachronic relation here, we have to account for the development of a semi-copular and copular element into an auxiliary, of course, as well as from an adjectival, a clearly adjectival element into a more verbal element, a verbal participle. Now, once the participle obtains these verbal properties, it apparently either denotes passive or active, of course. So an external argument suddenly becomes available, but of course in passive cases it remains implicit, and actually only in the context of the auxiliary have we can realize an overt referent for this external argument. And what we can also find is that these verbal participles oscillate basically between imperfectivity and perfectivity in the two kinds of constructions. Now, the main theses of my talk are the following. Passive and perfect paraphrases can diachronically be traced back to deverbal adjectives requiring a resultative adjectival head. These are uniformly reanalyzed as verbal participles employed in passive and perfect paraphrases alike, where the auxiliation of be and become is taken to be vacuous, but have crucially contributes active and perfect properties, and the distinction between passive and perfective participles can in turn be derived from the underlying event structure. Now, a potential problem for an approach along these lines is that the Romance passive actually might have to be traced back to the Latin verbal perfect passive participle, so a clearly verbal form, which seems to point to distinct grammaticalization paths. An additional issue is actually that the grammaticalization of passive and perfect paraphrases apparently doesn't coincide. Nevertheless, what I'll attempt to show in the present talk is that the grammaticalization paths may still be taken to converge in a single verbal participle. Okay, so much for the preliminaries, basically. Let's now turn to the grammaticalization of passive paraphrases. So let's first turn to the diachrony of passive paraphrases. These, as I hinted at before, may be taken to stem from copular constructions with be and become, and a resultative deverbal adjective, as in the examples in 12, 12a and 12b from Old English and Old High German. And the adjectival element in these denotes a result on the basis of an aspectual head combining with a simple change of state. And I will show in some more detail what that looks like in a second. And the main intuition here is that the requirement for such a result vanishes once the item is reanalyzed as an eventive passive participle. So let's take a look at the structural representations then. On the left-hand side here, we can see the structure that I'm proposing for the resultative participle. So the adjectival ancestor that we can see here is actually quite restricted with respect to its verbal domain. So here we just have a combination of an aspectual head and a simple change of state verb, basically. So you could also call that we become if you want to. And apparently such a combination of an aspectual head, of a participial aspectual head, and this change of state verb produces a result, and this result is taken up by the adjectival head and then attributed to some nominal referent as a state, basically. Now, what's interesting is what happens once we actually get an eventive counterpart. So what happens after reanalysis, so to speak. And my claim here is basically that the structure of the be become passive is what you can see on the right side, basically. Namely that there is more verbal structure involved here. So in addition to this simple verbal element, we can introduce a little v, so more verbal material, which also is capable of introducing an implicit external argument. And actually, one of the main claims of previous work of mine is that this allows us to account for the aspectual distinctions that we find here. So the participial aspectual head is taken to be incapable of denoting a result if there is a complex verbal domain featuring little v introducing an implicit external argument. Now this per se is not an entirely new assumption. In previous work, it just has been assumed, it just has been grasped in terms of an incompatibility of a resultative aspectual head and an agentive voice head, basically. So this is what can be seen in structures like these here from Embig and Sleeman, where we can actually see distinct aspectual heads being combined with distinct kinds of verbal domains, so to speak. Okay. Right. So rather than simply stipulating distinct aspectual heads, what I want to do is basically derive the aspectual flexibility from a single aspectual head that only manages to convey a result if the verbal predicate it combines with isn't too complex. And the early adjectival, the early deverbal adjectives, these do not exhibit this aspectual flexibility yet, as the co-predicative and predicative contexts they occur in basically impose a requirement for a result state, unlike the eventive participial counterparts, which allow for little v and hence readily denote ongoing events. So eventually, the auxiliation of a passive auxiliary allows for non-resultative aspectual heads, and a possible trigger for this may be seen particularly strongly in the case of become, in that in cases with become, there was a focus on a transition pointing to the possibility of a process reading before, actually. Okay, so much for the passive cases. Now let's turn to the grammaticalization of perfect paraphrases. So turning to the diachrony of the analytic perfect, we can see the same resultative participles attributing a result to a nominal referent, for instance, in the examples in 14. And here reanalysis leads to an eventive so-called perfect participle. And once again, we seem to start out with a similar kind of ancestor. And this ancestor, the resultative deverbal adjective, which is formally grasped as follows again, is severely restricted with respect to the amount of event structure that may be introduced, unlike what we actually find in the grammaticalized, reanalyzed cases on the right-hand side. Now, the hallmark of this approach basically is that, of course, what we get on the basis of the structure that we've proposed before with the additional verbal layer here, so to speak, is still a minus resultative, a spectral head. But in the case of the half perfect, we have around basically, and half is taken to be quite important for the formation of half perfects, in the sense that half is taken to be responsible for introducing an external argument as well as introducing a perfect time span. So basically it introduces an argument that takes care of licensing pro, and it also introduces relevant perfect properties. Right, so the auxiliation of half takes center stage here, and half may simply be taken to be the spell out of a perfect head and a voice projection introducing an external argument. Now this half perfect can later be extended to anergatives, of course, like the one in 16 here, they are celebrated. And this is quite simple, as we basically have the same underlying verbal structure. The only main difference here is the absence of the internal argument, basically. Right. So an analysis along these lines basically allows us to derive the perfect, okay, right, I should briefly turn to the empirical motivation, a possible empirical motivation for this reanalysis, which may actually be found in the inference that the argument introduced by the main verb have is responsible for bringing about the result state, which actually points to the existence of a more elaborate verbal domain. Now, an analysis along these lines allows us to derive the perfect properties from the same eventive passive participle that I've introduced before. But actually the term passive is not entirely appropriate here either, as this analysis actually also straightforwardly extends to unaccusatives. So what we can see on the right-hand side here is the structure that I assume for unaccusative predicates, which are capable of giving rise to a resultative, a spectral interpretation. And this is taken to be enough. This is taken to be enough for the proper formation of a perfect paraphrases. So we don't need have in the context of these unaccusative elements. So we end up with be perfect in language, with a be perfect in languages making use of auxiliary alternation. Of course, in case be is already occupied with forming the passive, we might still have to extend to have to form unaccusatives in have only languages actually. Okay. So what we end up with is actually a complementary distribution of be perfects and be become passives, as we can see on this slide here, with respect to their verbal domain. The former, so what we have on the left-hand side, need to be based on simple transitions, simple change of state verbs, or be become, as I said before, whereas the latter need to be derived from more complex events featuring this implicit argument, where the lack of a stativizing functional environment actually makes room for a more elaborate verbal domain in the first place. So if we have a stativizing functional environment, basically only the structure on the left-hand side, this reduced verbal domain, is possible with a copula instead of an auxiliary, of course, whereas a more elaborate verbal domain, as the one on the right-hand side, automatically gives rise to lack of resultativity, basically. Okay, so we can actually account for the flexibility of passive and perfect participles on the basis of a single so-called past participle then, even though that's a misnomer, of course, that occurs in both paraphrases alike after the successful auxiliation of the auxiliaries have and be. Now, the story actually is somewhat more intricate with respect to the passive in Romance, as I hinted at before. Latin apparently starts out with different source material, and that it makes use of the verbal PPP, the verbal perfect passive participle, which denotes eventive, passive, and perfect properties all along. Despite the fact that this formation, as we can see in 18 here, is actually structurally ambiguous with an adjectival counterpart. And here is the adjectival reading that we can also get from the case in 18, actually. This eventually entails that two structural configurations come into play as possible starting points of reanalysis, namely the verbal PPP and its adjectival counterpart. And these should then look as follows. Here we can see the verbal PPP structure basically, and as you can see here, the main distinction of this verbal PPP with respect to the structures that we've seen before is the properties of the aspectual head. So the aspectual head in Latin may denote perfective aspect regardless of the complexity of the verbal domain underneath it, basically. So this is one potential candidate for the reanalysis leading to eventive passive participles in the Romance languages eventually. The alternative candidate is what we can see on the right-hand side, namely, once again, a stative resultative configuration. So a structure that resembles the resultative participles that we've seen before. So we have two possible sources, and both of these sources have to change in crucial ways. Namely, what we have to do is either get rid of the adjectival head as in Germanic, as we can see on the left-hand side here, which of course we then have to account for why this adjectival head is lost. And on the right-hand side, the alternative variant, if we want to derive the verbal, if we want to derive the eventive passive participle from the verbal PPP, we have to get rid of this aspectual perfective head, which actually denotes fully fledged perfectivity, regardless of the complexity of the verbal domain underneath it. So these are the two possibilities, basically. And most interesting in this context is that late Latin actually already exhibits a new form that lacks any sense of resultativity or perfectivity. And this can be seen in the examples in 19 here. So this participle is actually bound to combine with perfective auxiliaries in order to shift the event into the past, as we can see in the comparison of 19a and 19b. And this eventually may be taken to culminate in imperfective paraphrastic passives. So what's particularly interesting here is that this new formation is actually on the rise in late Latin, as we can see in Lieven-Dankert's work, eventually ousting the perfective verbal counterpart and spreading to the whole passive paradigm. And evidence for this comes from word order, and that the new form undergoes a shift towards head initial, actually. And I assume that this form, this new passive form, is eventually taken over in early Romance and is still functional in modern varieties, as we can see in the Italian and French examples here in 20, arguably sharing the structural makeup attested for Germanic eventive passive participles. So the target form that we can see here is supposedly as in Germanic and also derived from a similar source. That is, we eventually end up with the same path, and this is what I try to show on the next slide here. We apparently find some evidence, at least, in favor of the analysis that we derive the eventive passive participle from this stative counterpart like we did in Germanic. So in conclusion, what I've argued is that the eventive passive in Romance was taken over from Latin, but does not equal the verbal PPP, and the perfect in turn, which I haven't particularly stressed here, was not just taken over from late Latin, but actually developed from the resultative in Romance. Now, additional support for these claims actually also comes from Slavic. Most Slavic languages employ morphologically distinct passive and perfect participles in the context of the auxiliary be to form the passive and perfect paraphrases like the ones in 21a and 21b, where we can see the perfect L participle and the passive NT participle, basically.
Dennis, you have 5 more minutes.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
Perfect. Yeah, that should be enough. Right, so there are actually 2 exceptions to this, namely Macedonian and Kashubian, which grammaticalized a proper half-perfect relatively recently. And what's striking about these is that they are based on passive and not on perfect participles, as observable in the cases in 22, which are actually, morphologically speaking, passive participles combined with the auxiliary have to form a half-perfect. Now, taking a look at their historical development, what we can see here in these 2 Slavic languages is that these may actually also be traced back to a resultative adjectival variant of the passive participle, as in the Macedonian case that we have here in 23. And while similar stative configurations may be found in other Slavic languages as well, in none of these we actually find a proper half-perfect. So in none of these, a half-perfect has properly been grammaticalized. Right, so there are some typical properties that these other Slavic languages do not exhibit, which shows us that none of these has a properly grammaticalized half-perfect. So grammaticalized half-perfects only occur in Macedonian and Kashubian, actually. Right, and in those 2 languages, we find the typical properties. So once again, a development from stative to eventive. We also find the loss of agreement morphology in the context of half-perfect, and we even find auxiliary alternation in Kashubian. And in the Slavic languages, reanalysis seems to be heavily favored by language contact, actually. So this seems to be one of the main driving forces behind this reanalysis that we find here in Macedonian and Kashubian. And this is then somewhat reminiscent of what we've seen in Latin, in the sense that the passive seems to predate the grammaticalization of a half-perfect here. Okay, so as my time is almost up, I will turn to some concluding remarks. So I've tried to briefly show that passive and perfect paraphrases can be traced back to analogous grammaticalization paths, namely the reanalysis of deverbal adjectives as eventive past participles. And this verbal form exhibits passive characteristics and retains the aspectual properties of its adjectival counterpart. And considering the contribution of have, this may be taken into account for passive and perfect paraphrases. What I've tried to show is that the Latin intricacies can actually be debunked in the sense that the Romance passive is taken over from Latin, but it doesn't equal the verbal PPP, but rather seems to be derived from a stative counterpart as well. And then we've seen that support for these claims also comes from the recent grammaticalization of a half-perfect in Slavic, which can be traced back to the resultative variant of the passive participle. So eventually, we can conclude that the grammaticalization paths of the perfect and the passive paraphrases converge in a single past participle, and possible sources for these individual reanalyses seem to amount to abducting distinct properties that are more economical as well as language contact, although, of course, much more should be said about this, which I haven't done in this talk. So while I tried to lay out a theoretical account here, many rather more empirical questions actually remain open. So for instance, the precise timing of grammaticalization is pretty hard to pin down, as there are some very early instances of supposedly grammaticalized have perfects, which actually even occur with intransitive verbs, and progressive passives as well, with non-transitional verbs in this case. This is directly related to the fact that it's really quite difficult to find reliable formal diagnostics for the grammaticalization at hand. So just focusing on agreement in perfect cases, or the occurrence of agentive adjuncts in passive cases, for instance, doesn't really seem to do the trick, unfortunately. So I would really be glad if somebody could point me to more reliable sources here, but I found it pretty hard to pin this down when exactly the individual grammaticalization processes kicked in, actually. But we do find some very early instances, which certainly deserve some additional attention. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. Here are my references, although unfortunately these are really, really small. I'm sorry about that. And I'm now really looking forward to the discussion period. Thank you.